Who is Jesus and why did he come to earth? Why is it important that I have that completely clear? Now again, in our culture, in our society, we are dealing with many people who would say that, well, if Jesus existed, and they would say that there's perhaps question about that, which is rather ridiculous. If Jesus existed, he was perhaps a good teacher, a moral leader, a misunderstood political figure. And so it's very interesting that in our time, it is very similar to the writer of Hebrews and what they were facing. Back when this was written, one of the big ideas was, well, you can't deny many of Jesus' miracles. There were just too many witnesses. Too many people were able to say, I was there, I saw what he did. Obviously, he was divine. And the first heresy was he wasn't really man, he was all God. He just looked like a man, Docetism. One of the other very quick heresies was because he was obviously doing works and able to do things most people couldn't do or anybody else could do. Maybe he was just a mighty angel. Now this was a popular kind of thought at that time. Gnosticism, you try to find the most powerful angel that you can and try to climb up this sort of network of angels. Maybe Jesus was just a very powerful angel. And so the writer to Hebrews begins with, as we have seen over the last couple of weeks, this is God's supreme revelation. There is nothing else that is going to be coming because Jesus is the complete revelation, the final statement. There's nothing else to add. We saw that Jesus is greater than any angel. And of course, he's greater than any other man. And so we began in chapter 2 with the idea of be very careful with what you've heard. As you begin to put all this together, be very careful with what you've heard. Make sure you realize Jesus was not just a gifted teacher. Make sure you realize he was not just some sort of a divine person. Make sure you realize that Jesus and his words and his truth are the final revelation from God. There will be none other. Chapter 2 then began to go with what are the consequences of that. And we saw that, well, there are consequences for Jesus. Because he was obedient, he now sits at the right hand of the Father. Because he was obedient even unto the cross, he has been exalted, as we read in chapter 2, verse 7. Who is this person? There's no other person that the Almighty has said, come and sit on my right hand. I'll make the nations your footstool. I have put all things under your control. Well, he hasn't said that to anybody else. And then we get towards our final here this morning. Verse 10, what was the whole purpose of this? Okay, if Jesus came to earth, he really was the Son of God. This is the final revelation from God. There is nothing else. What do we make of it? Well, the whole purpose wasn't to be a teacher, wasn't to be a moral example, wasn't to be kind of an encouragement. So it's, you can do this. Just see how Jesus did it. You can do this. Jesus didn't come to kind of make that Solomon kingdom where we all get prosperous and we have better material standards. Verse 10, for it was fitting for him, for whom are all things and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons and daughters into God's kingdom. That was the purpose. Because he is the very, we said the word is like pioneer of salvation, the first one to make it happen, and now we follow in that direction. We went to verse 14. Therefore, since we are all alike, and Jesus truly was one of us, he shared in all of our attributes. He shared in our nature. He shared in our experience. He knows what it's like to be one of us. And recently we looked at verse 16. And we said this was kind of an odd word in the Greek. It's like, duh, putting this all together, Jesus didn't come to rescue angels. Jesus didn't come to lead angels anywhere. Jesus came for mankind. And I still struggle with that idea. If I was going to make a major campaign against the devil and all of his angels, I would say, well, can't we get some more on our side? Maybe we can get some of his angels to come back on our side, and we'll have more angels. It's a very humbling, it's a very serious idea to begin to grasp that this isn't about angels. God's kingdom is not about angels, it's about people. It's about you and I. And that was the whole purpose. That he came not to help angels, not to lead angels anywhere, not to give angels a second chance. He came to do something with mankind. And in doing so, the first thing he did was rendered the power of the fallen one void. We no longer fear death. We no longer fear death. And so in verse 17, as we pick up this morning, so what did Jesus really do? As we have said previously, in any great war, in any great campaign, there's misdirection, misunderstanding. We struggle to understand what was going on, and of course, the adversary was completely clueless as to what was going on. What was the real plan for Jesus? Well, the obligation was to complete what he had started by becoming one of us. Just in becoming one of us, we find it hard to see that. As we were sitting in traffic, beginning to talk this morning, because there was nothing else to do, just sitting in traffic, we started to talk about the holidays and who might be coming over. And isn't it crazy? We're talking about holidays already. But if you think about Christmas, you think about that baby in the manger, we don't necessarily think, now that began a whole process. Just coming to earth has set into motion so many different things that we would completely miss. What did it mean for Jesus just to come and be one of us? What kind of a process was set in motion? What were the consequences? One of the consequences was, and again the writer to Hebrews really trying to make us understand this, he really was just like you and I. He really was just like you and I. And I struggle with that. If Jesus was here this morning, if he came through those doors and sat down in the back row, we would think angels would be here. There would be music from heaven. According to Isaiah, he wouldn't be very impressive at all. He would just look like one of us. It would be easy to miss. If Jesus was here this morning, he would look like you and I and not very impressive. Not 6'6" with the Hollywood muscles. He would just look like a normal person because in so many ways he was. Now, if Jesus is a normal person, you started that process, Jesus, by becoming one of us. Now you have to follow through with that. This is an interesting word that this verse begins with. Verse 17. Therefore, this is not the usual therefore, and of course anytime you see therefore, you want to ask the big question, what is it there for? The writer is beginning to conclude the first two chapters, and especially verses 10 and following. Now, wrapping this all up, we could almost say it this way. Now, wrapping this up, if you're going to become mankind, what are the obligations? What were the needs to do this? And again, we are trying to put together, why would Jesus come to earth anyway? Therefore, he had to be made like his brethren. It was necessary. This was the only way. Now, this is an interesting word. It comes from the finance area in Greek. It means to pay a debt. It means that you are coming up with a resolution to something you have already started. Isn't that a fascinating idea? He had to become like one of us. He had to. You think, well, why did Jesus have to become like one of us? Because the writer is continually impressing upon us he really was one of us. He wasn't just an angel who was kind of like one of us. He wasn't the Son of God coming to earth who just kind of appeared to be like one of us. He really was exactly like you and I. Well, if that's the case, what else had to follow from that? By beginning the process of becoming a man, he now picks up some other ideas. In all things. I know your translations may vary at this point. Some of you may have King James, some of you may have other things, the ESV. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in all things. Again, the writer to Hebrews wants to impress upon us it wasn't just kind of like being a human. He really experienced our nature, our character. He knows what it's like to be tired. He knows what it's like to be hungry. He knows what it's like to be rejected. He knows what it's like to be ignored. He knows, and this is the most important one, he knows what it's like to be tempted. We sometimes miss that. Jesus going into the wilderness to be tempted by the fallen one, that's a very dramatic scene. That wasn't the only time Jesus was tempted. Jesus was likely tempted every day, constantly. Why? Because I am. And if he's just like me, which is kind of a scary thought, Jesus like me, he was tempted constantly. You can take a shortcut. You don't have to do this. You don't have to be obedient, You can do this on your own. The same way I'm tempted. You don't really need to be obedient. You deserve to take a break today. You deserve not to do this. Are you really sure God's law is best? Imagine that now, which is hard for us to do, that Jesus is enduring constantly, along with disciples who can't get it, along with religious leaders who should have recognized him but don't, who are now advising people to ignore him, slander, reproach, rejection, all of those things. He's like us in every way. Again, there's some great hope here. You can't be going through anything. You can't be going through anything that Jesus can't say, I can identify with that. Sickness, financial issues, family drama. He was truly one of us. He can identify with all of that. It is not possible for you to be in a situation where you're going to be able to say, Jesus doesn't know what I'm dealing with. Jesus doesn't know what I'm struggling with here. If Jesus was in this situation, he would know I need to do something different. Wrong. He knows what it's like to be going through exactly what you're going through, because he's exactly like one of us. If he is exactly like one of us, then he has to deal with sin. Now, we get to a very, very hard to see conclusion to this. Therefore, if he has been made to be exactly like us so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. That was the purpose. He had to be like one of us because he had to deal with sin. In dealing with sin, he became our merciful and faithful high priest. He didn't come here to make us more prosperous. He didn't come here to get us better parking spaces. Now, what is being stated here was what we ignore so often. What is the real problem that Jesus came to solve? Well, sin. We might be satisfied with Jesus helping us with virtually anything else. We would be very satisfied. Jesus, can you deal with this health issue? Jesus, can you help me with this financial problem? Jesus, can you make my retirement a little bit better? Jesus, if I didn't have to deal with these family issues, if my family would kind of respect me the way they should. You might be surprised to hear that. I have family members who don't really respect me. I have family members who ignore my spiritual ideas. I have family members who do not give me much of any sort of position in the family. I deal with that. That's not what Jesus came to correct. He came to correct the problem of my sin. And in so doing, he became my high priest. Now, for you Gentiles, that's an odd idea. Well, Jesus became a high priest. What was that, a job promotion? Now he gets the corner office? He's kind of the CEO? If we remember, to understand Hebrews, we really need to understand Exodus. And Exodus is all about the law. How do I make myself okay with God? Well, no sooner do you have the law than you need priests who deal with the problem that we can't obey the law. You have to have a priest. If you're going to have the law, you have to have a priest because we can't obey the law. And so here's the issue. If there is no high priest, you have no forgiveness for your sin. If you have no high priest, you have no forgiveness for your sin. And especially on that one day of the year, Yom Kippur. You've done all the sacrifices going up to that very day. Yom Kippur is not about trespassing. Yom Kippur is not about uncleanliness. All of those other sacrifices. And remember, here's the big issue. In Exodus and Leviticus, all of the sacrifices deal with, if it should come to your mind and someone points out to you, hey, you know that was unclean and you touched it. And you will say, I didn't know that. I need to go take care of my uncleanliness now. I need to go make a sacrifice. I challenge you to read through Leviticus and Exodus. None of the sacrifices are really made for the sins that I do. My sins aren't done accidentally. I do them on purpose. There's no sacrifice for that. Those are sins of a high hand. You're just guilty. Isn't that an awkward idea? The idea is if you know the law, you keep it. Oh, you didn't keep the law? You're just a rebel. Jesus is my faithful high priest. Well, what was a problem in the Old Testament is a problem in the New Testament. We need someone who can deal with our sin. We need someone who can deal with our sin. This is what Jesus came to be. Far beyond, I'm convinced, any idea that our adversary had. Jesus didn't come to assemble some sort of big army. Let's battle it out. Jesus didn't come to try to resurrect some Solomonic empire. It was far bigger than that. Jesus came to deal with our sin. And in so doing, he became our high priest. Now, just like the high priest once a year goes in praying for the mercy of God upon his people as he goes into the Holy of Holies, that's what Jesus is doing now for us, interceding with us